and welcome everyone to the English Language Testing Society webinar for April. And we'll be discussing testing vocabulary today. My name is Michael Fields. I'm at the University of Delaware here in the United States at the English Language Institute. And this is very interactive, so I'm going to be sort of leading us through this, but if you have any questions, comments, feel free to just shout it out. Now, I won't see all of you on my screen because I'm screen sharing, so you don't need to raise your hand. If you have a comment, you can really just shout it out. That might be the best way. All right, and we want to thank ITEP, the International Test of English Language Proficiency, our sponsor today. So thank you very much from ITEP for sponsoring our webinar. And let's go ahead and talk about the construct. When we think about testing, the first thing we always want to do is define the construct, right? So what is it that we're trying to test? And I think sometimes when we think about grammar and vocabulary, it's very easy. So those are more that's more knowledge rather than skill, right? When we talk about grammar and vocabulary, it's more about declarative knowledge. And I think sometimes it's easy to sort of skip over this step. But maybe it's a good thing to talk about the construct. And what is a word, I think, is one question we can ask. And that seems very self-explanatory, but maybe it's a little trickier than we might think it is. What is a word? What does it mean to know a word? And in what ways do we want our students to know the words that we are testing? And I think if we can answer those questions, we've made the first step in thinking about how we're going to design our vocabulary tests. So what is a word? What is a word? I think everyone can agree, I hope. Of course, you put 10 teachers in a room and you get 15 opinions, right? So, but I hope that everyone can agree that house and red and photo and sleep and carry and particle, consume and steep. I think we can all agree that those are words, right? I mean, I don't think there would be much argument about teaching those words as words, testing those words, putting them on a vocabulary test. Pretty straightforward. What about these word forms like went? How do you feel about testing that as a vocabulary word? Normally, we might consider that as a form of go, and we might test it in terms of grammar. But how do you feel about testing words like went or taken or cries, which has that irregular plural IES, or syllabi, which is a common irregular plural, or applicant, which is a word form of application, right? How do we feel about testing these as words? Any comments? Any ideas? Is it fair to test these as words or not?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think it's fair to test it, and I think it should be associated, or the way I see it is associated to some kind of image to provide context, because that's what the challenge for me is, the context. And your question, in what way do we want our students to know the word? So in an interaction.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, Alina. We're going to come to that. So the first thing we're thinking about, because we want to be very systematic about defining our construct. So the first thing we want to answer is what is a word, and then we'll come to those other questions, and then we'll look at some item formats. So I think it's important, and Alina, thanks for bringing that up. I think it's important not to jump ahead, and that's a very common thing that we as teachers do. We want to jump ahead and we want to design the item formats. But before we've defined what we want to test, it's no good trying to define those item formats before we've really established what exactly we want to test. Okay, so any other comments about this level of word forms? Any other comments? All right, let's go ahead. What about these these phrasal verbs then, or put off, get over, end up, come up with, get rid of. How many people feel that these could be counted as words? Or maybe not?
Hi, can I speak?
Please.
I think all of these can be words. I think they can all be something that you can have a lesson from them. Obviously, with phrasal verbs, you can discuss with things within grammar terms, but they can be things that items that you can be discussing from a context. And they are part of the language, and I would define them all as words, but how you are teaching them, how they are being used, that would probably dictate a different form of testing. That's my 2 cents.
Okay, wonderful. Anyone else?
I think they all carry meaning in themselves, each of the examples that you wrote. And as such, they could be tested, but it's hard for me to decide whether they should be tested without thinking about the context in which they will be tested.
Yeah, of course, Rosario, and we'll come to that. That's a very interesting question, and that's what Alina was saying too. And we will come to that, the context. So we're not there yet, but yes. And yeah, and I want to mention, I've written here that these all function as a lexical unit. Maybe that's the best definition of these phrasal verbs, because as we know, put off is not the same as put, and get over is not the same as get, and end up is not exactly the same as end, although there's some similarity there, right? And come up with has nothing to do with coming, right? So, we can't really separate these phrasal verbs from each other and get the same meaning. And these do function as lexical units. So it's something to think about. I think someone mentioned thinking about them. I think Judith said something about thinking about them as grammar, in terms of grammar. Which we could also do that, and but today we want to focus on vocabulary. Judith, do you have another comment? I see your hand up. Okay, let's think about, how about things like sailboat, or clearance sail, or heaven and earth, or on the air. How do you feel about testing these as vocabulary?
I think they could be called lexical units too. So as such, they could be tested.
Okay, wonderful. Anybody opposed to that idea?
I'm not opposed. This is Judith again. I would put these as collocations. Obviously, how they are expressed in English may not be necessarily how they're expressed in another language. So I would be interested to have these in a listening or have these in a reading where students can see them within the use of the language rather than just as isolated words.
Yeah, that's absolutely. And again, we'll get to context a little later. So I'm not suggesting that we just test these kind of, completely in isolation. How we test them is another question, but I think the first thing to think about is defining, where are the limits when we talk about vocabulary? Where are the limits to vocabulary? When can we say this is a vocabulary word, and when can we say this is not really vocabulary anymore? So again, I want to just do this very systematically and think about this from an assessment perspective, where we first define the construct, and then we move forward with how we'll test. But thank you, Judith. And finally, and again, maybe taking that next step, how about collocations like, for example, on the other hand, at best, etc. You can think of so many more examples of these sorts of multi-word phrases that function to basically construct one meaning. Okay? So that's our first question. Our next question, if we can define what a word is, or if you can define what a word is in your context, is what does it mean to know a word? So let's think about again, about these different levels. Let's say we're taking something as easy as the word table. Now we all know what table is. That seems like a very basic word, right? And if we just think about table and chairs, right? That sort of table. Well, that's an A1 word if you're familiar with the CEFR. That's a very low beginning level word, but that's not the only meaning of table, right? We might refer to a chart, a kind of chart, also in a textbook as a table. Or we might table a discussion, or we might talk about the water table. And this is still the word table, but this is the word table being used in very different ways. So which definition of a word do we want to test when we think about testing vocabulary? And obviously it should be the same definition that you've taught in class. We shouldn't teach in one way and then suddenly spring a different use of the word on our students. And that also can be said for parts of speech, right? If we teach a word as a noun and then test it as a verb, it's not really a fair ball for the students, right? If they've only seen it and they've only learned it and you've only expected them to recognize it as a noun and then you give it to them as a verb, it's not really throwing them a fair ball, right? Do we want to test the ability to spell the word? Is that important when we test vocabulary? And do we want an exact spelling, or do we accept a recognizable spelling? Where do we draw the limits on spelling? Do we want the students to recognize the spoken form of the word? Is that something, not only in writing, but do we expect them to recognize the word when they hear it? Sometimes, as you know, in English, our crazy barbaric language, the spelling and the writing can be very different sometimes, right? Rosario is smiling and shaking her head, and she says, you know, Spanish is just a beautiful language. If I can spell it, I can say it. If I can say it, I can spell it. And we know English is just not like that. So I can't do anything about that. I didn't invent this language, I just speak it, right? Do we want our students to recognize or use the word forms? So, and I just gave the example of apply, applied, application, applicant. Are we expecting them to be able to know these forms, or are we only working on one form? And again, up to this point, I've been talking mainly about recognition, which is a really major point. But here, let's turn to production. Are we looking only for recognition, or are we expecting our students to be able to produce the word and use it correctly, or use it effectively? Do we expect our students to know what collocates? So when we listen to, we don't just listen, but we have to listen to something. We have to talk about something, right? In other languages, we might use different prepositions in these cases that collocate with these verbs. In German, for example, we don't talk about things, we talk over things. And there's no reason why one is more or less correct. It's just really an agreed usage. There's nothing more or less, there's nothing inherently correct about those prepositions, because these are not actually spatial relationships when we talk or listen, right? Why do we say happy birthday and not merry? What's wrong with merry birthday? We say Merry Christmas. Why not merry birthday? Well, the fact is we just don't say that, right? We might have a big problem. We don't really have a difficult problem in English, or it's less common, right? So we could say difficult problem. I'd probably tend to say personally a big problem. And knowing translations also, do we expect our students to know the translation of the word into their first language, or are there any special problems of translation? And I just gave you a few examples here, like the German word Kultur, which really translates as civilization, or the French word effectivement, which looks like effectively, but in fact, it means in fact. I just said in fact twice. In fact, it means in fact. It doesn't really mean effectively. And the Spanish word actual, which means current. It doesn't mean real, but it means present or current, right? So these are sort of special considerations in translation. All right. Any comments, questions at this point? Any comments or questions? All right. We'll go ahead then. And again, in what ways do we want our students to know the words? Do we want them simply to recognize words? Is it for reading purposes? And if it is, we can expect our students to master many, many words in a very short period. Or do we want our students to be able to produce the words? And if that's the case, we're going to see much slower progress. They'll be able to, quote unquote, know a word. It'll take longer, and we won't see them knowing and be able to produce on a test so many words. And then I think another important question is, how do we teach vocabulary? Because remember that we should be testing in the same way that we teach. We shouldn't be teaching in one way and then suddenly the students see something entirely different on a test. So when we think about vocabulary, do we give our students lists? In some cases, you may. Do we teach always in context? Are our students keeping a vocabulary log? Are they learning vocabulary in natural language encounters? So these are also things to consider when we try to define our construct before moving on to actually testing. So so this is about the construct. Oh, I guess one more point is, let's think about the level of vocabulary, and we can think of it, I like to think of it as like a tree, right? So we start out with these very basic words, and we can think about what that means. And then we move on to these sorts of general words that we'd use in general conversation. We might see them in magazines and newspapers. We might hear them on television or in movies. These sorts of words that we use to support general communication. And then, of course, tied into that are our advanced words, which we'll also see often in general contexts. And above that, we have our academic words. And if you're familiar with the academic word list, if you're not familiar with that, it's a wonderful list. It was a PhD. It was a PhD dissertation by a woman, I don't remember her name, in New Zealand. And she found 700 word families that are used across disciplines, that appear most frequently in academic language. And that's of course going beyond the basic and general words, but actually the academic words. She identified about 700 word families that we'll find throughout the disciplines. And then after that, we have our discipline-specific words, right? Which our native speakers are often learning along with their studies. So we don't expect our L2 students to know these words, but we don't really expect our native speakers to know these words either. So this is really specialized vocabulary, and it's not so much about learning English as much as it is discipline specific, which means that often when we think about what we're teaching in terms of a foreign language, we may want to think about these levels. Any questions or comments before we go on? Any questions or comments? I'm very happy to hear all of you. This is, I guess, a little bit me-fronted today, but let's go ahead and then look at some item design. Oh, sorry, one more thing about level of vocabulary. If you're not familiar with the English profile, I just wanted to share that with you. You can look this up. Englishprofile.org. This is a wonderful piece of software. You can use it for American English. You can use it for British English. I'm sorry, there's no Canadian or Australian, at least not yet. You can type a word in here. If you prefer, you can, I didn't do it. This is just a sort of a screenshot. I didn't do it, but if you want to be topic specific, you can do it. If you only want nouns, or you only want verbs, or you only want adjectives, you can ask for that. And when you hit search, it's going to give you, here's the word save. And it's found at least 5, there may have been more that I wasn't able to copy, I don't remember. It's found 5 different uses of the word save, some of them at the B1 level, and some of them at the A2 level. So this is if you're constructing vocabulary tests, or if you're constructing reading tests or listening tests, and you're curious about if the level of some vocabulary words is appropriate, you can use the English profile, and you can see what level that's coming out as, that particular word, and just in the way that you're using the word. So if you're using save to mean save money, we can assume that that's an A2 level. So that's a pretty basic level, to save money, or to save, meaning not to throw away, to keep something. But then if we use save, for example, to not waste something, for example, saving resources, we might find that is a little higher lexical level. So let's go ahead and look at testing receptive vocabulary, some different item styles. This one's very straightforward. I think probably most people are familiar with this. We're just giving a certain vocabulary word and 4 possible definitions. There's no context whatsoever. Of course, only one of them is the correct definition, but all of them should be plausible, right? All of them should be plausible. So in this unit, we might have encountered the word rhino in a unit on wild animals and zoos, or something like this. So we give these 4 possible definitions. A tropical plant, well, rhinos are in the tropics. That's not it's obviously not the correct answer, but it's not out of imagination that it could be some kind of tropical plant. If we'd read a unit, on that, and the student maybe doesn't remember the word rhino. Yeah, it sounds very plausible. A large animal, a room in a zoo. If there were zoos connected to the context, then maybe the rhino is a room. Of course, that's not the right answer. Or is it food for another wild animal or a zoo animal, right? So this is an example of, very basic example of testing receptive vocabulary. We may also want to use a very short context. So she was hired at the minimum wage. We have a very short context. We're given the word that we're testing in the stem, and the options ask you for the definition. So it's very similar to the last one, except now we have a little context. So again, the item is given in the stem. The definition, the options are the definitions. We may also see a variation on this, and this quiz has 10 questions. This is just one of them. In this case, the vocabulary word is in the stem, but we're not given that word. We're given 4 possible vocabulary words that the students were asked to study. Only one of them is the correct answer. Only one of them can reasonably fit into that sentence to make a meaningful sentence. I think one thing to watch out for when you're constructing these kinds of items is that there's only one possible definition, or sorry, not definition, but only one possible word. So a special committee was created to ensure the success of the project. I think that's the correct answer. To aerobic the success of the project, no, doesn't work. To incentive the success doesn't work. To evident doesn't work. So I think in this case, we need to be careful to make sure that there's not more than one possible option. Again, if comments, questions, please shout it out. Please shout it out. Okay.
Sorry, quick question about that.
Yes.
Do you tend to try to, when you do a question like the previous one, do you tend to try to do the same parts of speech? Because I know that I noticed that they weren't, but to have maybe all verbs there, for example, or do you think it doesn't really matter that much?
That's a really good question, and I think there are layers. That's a very good question. I think there are layers of answers to that question. So first of all, we would Alyssa, is it?
That's fine. Yeah, Alyssa.
Alyssa, okay, great. So first of all, we would then expect our students to be familiar enough with these words. And in this case, these are advanced level words, right? We'd expect our students to be familiar enough with these words to be able to identify which ones are nouns, which ones are verbs, which ones are adjectives, for example, which is already part of the task. But you're right that what we don't want to do is test grammar. And we don't also want to, we don't want the students to be able to find the answers by using grammar or knowledge of grammar, because then they're not showing their knowledge of vocabulary, which is a very good point. So that's certainly a consideration. And as we know in assessment, we're always trying to balance different factors. So there's no clear, straightforward answer. In this case, and I'll just tell you, in this case, the students had a limited number of words that they needed to study for this test. So it's not always possible to put 4 verbs and make sure that only one of them works and the other 3 absolutely don't work. So that's why in this particular test, we get those different parts of speech. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So it's a very good point. And if you're teaching at a level where you believe that giving them the wrong part of speech is going to allow them to answer by process of elimination, then it's probably not a good idea. Here is another example of short context. We have, as you can see, we have single sentences, which create the context. And then students are choosing from a word bank here. So they're going to use all of the words or perhaps most of the words, right? And this is from a textbook, by the way. The last one is from a Canvas quiz, and this one is from a textbook. So this is basically it's a sort of variation on the one we just saw. In this case, they're simply choosing from a word bank in order to select the right answers. And again, this is receptive because they're being given the words, right? They're not producing these words. This is a variation where they have a text and they need to read a definition. They're given the part of speech and they're given the paragraph. So they need to go into the paragraph and find, they're only looking for nouns. So that's some help, right? And they're looking for a noun that fits this definition. So this is, again, another way of testing. And we're getting a lot more context here, right? Because the text that they're seeing is a multi-paragraph text. So they're really seeing these words in context. And again, this is probably better for lower levels. We might do a kind of word association where they simply have to circle. And it's not necessarily for lower levels, but they have to circle the words that are colors right? Or they have to find things in a kitchen. Or they have to identify farm animals. So this, again, is a kind of receptive test. Any questions up to this point? Questions or comments?
Yeah. Yeah, Michael, can I come in?
Please, yes, please.
All right. I can sense that sometimes if we don't pay attention, we are not careful about these details in evaluation, then we do harm our learners. So I can sense that it's a matter of the backward design so that we know our target, right? It's a bit of my comments.
Yeah, and I think, yes, absolutely. And I think, I don't know the context you are working in, but I can say from my experiences, I've worked with many very good, very qualified teachers who are simply not well informed about assessment. And I don't it's not a criticism in any way. It's simply a matter of not having had the kind of training. And so I see sometimes very good teachers making very basic mistakes in terms of how they are assessing, and thinking that, well, if I know what I want to assess, then I can assess it, but not putting a lot of attention into a proper construction of assessment. And of course, when we don't do that, then we don't know what we're assessing. And assessment is part of student outcomes, and we're using assessments to make decisions about students. And if we're assessing them poorly, then our decisions about student outcomes are also somewhat poor. So I think it's really important to try to consider that, how can we most meaningfully assess our students? So even something as simple as saying, which ones are farm animals? I mean, and this is not the only way to do it, but yeah. Is that?
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, I get you. And this is the enlightenment we want, we are expecting. If you don't know how to come up with the assessment for your students' performance, yeah, as I said it earlier, you're harming their education. Thanks indeed for this input.
Yeah, and not harming their education. And also, I think when we think about formative assessment, then we don't know what they have learned, or if we don't assess well, we don't know what they have learned or haven't learned. We don't know what we should reteach. So
Actually,
it's another level of complication, right?
All right, thanks indeed.
Let's go ahead and, oh, sorry, one more for receptive. I think this is the last one. And this is about testing in longer context. This is very similar to the one we saw before, but here now we have, rather than single sentences, we have paragraphs. And we're going to select, and we have a word bank, and we're going to select multiple words to put into paragraphs. And again, this is about building context, contextualizing more. Okay, so this is one more style of testing receptive vocabulary. Oh, sorry, I think we have a couple more. This is one that I really like, by the way. In this case, the vocabulary that we're testing are the bolded words. And what we need to do is match the two parts of the sentence. I'm not sure those are correct. To match the two parts of the sentence to make a meaningful sentence, and every sentence has one tested vocabulary item. Just another form. And finally, this is a really fun one too. And I think these are more creative and maybe more motivational. So we can think of the last two especially, and maybe the other one where it's in context. And I think anytime that we're testing in a more creative way, kind of alternative assessment, right? More creative, it fosters learning while being assessed. And also, I just think it increases motivation. In this case, students have to read the two sentences which contain tested vocabulary. And that's in bold, just to help us. And decide if the meaning is the same or different. And as we can see, and this is these are also very good examples of paraphrasing, right? So as we can see, cognitive ability paraphrases to think and reason. Promising is used as a paraphrase for optimistic. New research, new studies. And of course, we have researchers, which reinforces that it's research. Okay, and then we get play math games. So really good examples of paraphrasing also. Any comments, questions at this point?
Yeah, I have a question. How do you define the limit there? So as to whether you're testing vocabulary or reading ability, or vocabulary and reading ability.
That's
Reading skills.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there are always trade-offs in assessment, right? If we want to really isolate vocabulary, then maybe we should have no context. If your concern is that we want to isolate vocabulary, then I think we should have maybe no context or maybe very limited context. But if you're not concerned so much about isolating skills, and I think when we use language in real situations, we're often not using skills in isolation anyway, right? When we test listening, there's always some amount of reading involved. Unless you're testing at a very low level and you're asking students to listen and identify pictures. But otherwise, we're always asking students to read when we give listening tests. So I sort of think of it as, what skill are we focusing on? What skill are we emphasizing? But not necessarily are we surgically isolating that skill, because it's usually not possible. It's probably not necessary. And again, you have to decide. I cannot sit here in my world and tell you how you should design listening tests for your context. My purpose here is to give you many possibilities, and which ones you find appropriate for your context is of course up to you. But these are just many possibilities. And you know your context. I don't know your context. I don't know, and of course our assessment should be based on our teaching, so I don't know how you teach or what you teach. So that's going to influence a lot, of course. But also I think that the last few examples I gave are really more kind of alternative assessments. They're more formative assessments. I think I'm very much in favor, and again, I don't know how you feel. I'm very much in favor of assessing while learning and allowing students to learn through their assessments, project-based assessment, alternative assessments, formative assessments. I'm very much in favor of those kind of assessments. And I also believe that there is a need and there's a place for traditional summative assessments. I certainly believe there's a place for traditional summative assessments, but I don't think that we should separate the assessment from the learning all the time and say, okay, here I'm going to teach you and then I'm going to assess you later. And then we sort of shroud the assessment in mystery, right? The teaching is very open, and then suddenly, you know, it's good cop, bad cop, right? We were always the good cop, and now we're the bad cop, and we're assessing them, and it's shrouded in mystery. I think it's much more beneficial for students to do these sorts of formative assessments where they learn through their assessments. It's my belief, and you really don't need to agree with me. But great question. Great question. Let's look now at productive vocabulary. We're asking students to produce language in this case. This is in this case, it's sort of a low level. I've seen these sorts of items often used at low levels. I think you could also do it at higher levels. What can a table be made of? Maybe wood. We're just helping them by giving them the first letters. Maybe you don't want to give them the first letter. Maybe you want to give the first and last letter. It depends again on your context. The place where you live is probably a house. It might grow in your backyard. Is a tree, and you can watch movies on it, of course, is a television. Points off for spelling. All right. This is one example. Very context-free. Of course, if we're going to ask them to produce language, there's always going to be some amount of context, right? In this one, they're producing a word, and we would, you know, like to believe that it's a word they've studied. Maybe it comes from a list. Maybe it comes from the context of the last unit, right? But in this case, they're producing from themselves vocabulary. No help except the context. The company did really well last year. Its profits were $7 million, right? To expand the business, they needed to get a loan from a bank. And the shirt was, and again, maybe someone will say, well, that's not a word. That's not fair. That's not a word. Depends on how you define a lexical unit, right? The shirt was on sale.
May I ask you a question, please?
Absolutely,
so
please.
is it testing productive vocabulary in context? So I see there's a little bit of context for the first and the second. What I don't see for the third, what is the context for the student?
To say that it was on sale.
The shirt was the
50% off. But we can also imagine, and again, it depends on your context, right? We can imagine that they may have studied from a list. So there's a limited number of words that they might be, you know, asked to use, perhaps. And then, Alina, I think that's a really good question. What if someone gave a completely different word that fits here, that was not on your list, but it's correct? My feeling is I would accept it. I don't know how you feel. I would accept it if they said discounted, maybe, right? What if your Bright Eyes student gave you, everyone studied the same list, everyone knows it's on sale,
yeah.
but Bright Eyes gave you discounted. Would you accept that?
Yeah.
I would. You don't have to if you feel differently.
So the context, yeah, because they are recalling, you did a previous activity, so they are recalling, and that would be the context. But then when you provide the sentence here, you're suggesting, in some cases, we give them a little bit of context in the first sentence, like when they say the company did really well last year, that's a little bit of context for expansion, or
That's
family
right.
business, okay, and in the other one, okay, because they're recalling and that's the context. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and of course we assume that I mean, I think when we test vocabulary, unless we're doing a kind of proficiency test, right, which is entirely different. But in a proficiency test, you might just give it to them with no context and see what, I mean, no lists of words. We might just give them these and see what they come up with. But in a classroom testing environment, we would probably have a word bank that we're testing from. It's most likely, right? That it's some kind of test of, what we've taught in class, right? It's not a proficiency test. Yeah. And the close, if any of you are familiar with this, I'm putting this, I personally, I don't like closes, but I'm not going to censor you. Okay, I would not use this, but I'm not going to say that, that's not a reason for me not to present this as an alternative. So nope, I won't do it. But maybe you feel that, it's good in your context, or you like closes. It's another possibility to create a close. And again, we're going to expect that these blanked out words, you've got lots of context now, right? I think it's difficult to create these because one thing you want to avoid, what did I see? I don't remember. There are several words that are used more than once in this paragraph. So if you can identify them, for example, species, we don't want to test that word because it's used again. So it's not quite fair if they can see it, right? It's not really the same. It's not productive, completely productive if they can see it, right? Rate might be used more than once. I'm not sure. Yeah, here. Okay. So these are sometimes difficult to construct. And again, what if the student gives you something entirely different that works, but it's not what you were expecting? What if the student gives you something entirely different that changes the meaning, but still works in the context? It works, it gives you a meaning, but not the meaning that was intended. Is that then a correct answer or an incorrect answer? Well, I don't know. That's something that you need to decide, right? In your context. Looking at vocabulary forms. Word forms. Here's a table where we're going to fill in the noun form, the verb form, the adjective form, and the adverb form. If there is no adjective, if there is no adverb form in this case, we've just blacked out the square a little bit, so there's no answer there. We could do that, for any. If there was no adjective form, we could blank out that box, right? So this is about producing word forms. In this case, students are given a word bank and they're asked, again, this is about producing vocabulary in context. Of course, we do give them the words. So you could argue that it's not entirely production, but they need to demonstrate that they can use these words in context correctly or appropriately. And what is the limit on correctness? Again, that's up to you. But in this case, they're asked to write an email to a friend about a recent vacation. They have to use 5 words. And again, we can consider, is the spelling count? Well, we give them the words, so probably it does, but again, that's up to you. What if they used a different word form? Would you accept it, or do you only accept these exact words? And does it need to be Does it need to be used in the correct part of speech? You know, classic example, camping is actually a noun. Shopping is actually a noun. But what if they found a way to use them as verbs? Would you accept that, or would you not accept that? And how precisely do they need to use these words? What about collocations? So these are all things that you would probably want to make decisions about before you created this exercise, and not wait until afterwards and then realize. Of course, there's always that sort of unexpected thing that comes along, but if you have some rules that you will mark by beforehand, it makes it a lot fairer, really. A lot more reliable or consistent. Okay, so now we have a few minutes, and I just want to open up to questions and a discussion. What other vocabulary testing techniques have you used, and which styles have been the most successful for you? So I'm just going to open that up to anyone.
Well, thank you. If I may, I just wanted to kind of like give a comment about what you have presented and shared with us. So what you're suggesting is that it's very important to decide whether before applying a test or before going into the format of the item, to decide whether we're testing receptive skills or productive skills, whether that is aligned with the way we teach. If we teach vocabulary associated with listening and reading, and the type of exercise that that we do in class, that should be similar to what we are presenting to the students in the test. Is that correct?
Though, yeah, Alina, those are guidelines. And again, you will decide exactly how to apply those guidelines according to your own situation, right? But yes, those are guidelines. And I think one thing that, you know, we as teachers, we're always overworked, of course. And I think one thing teachers really love to do when they design a test is they sit down and say, okay, I'm going to write the questions. But skipping that step of clearly defining what it is they want to test and jumping right into the, you know, the production of the items or the text and items, but there's no consideration of what it is we want to test and how to best test it. So yeah, absolutely. I'm really suggesting being able to answer those questions for yourself before you jump in to writing the items. And that will be a much better test in that case.
Gracias. Thank you.
De nada. Other comments and questions?
Well, another vocabulary testing technique I've used is just to match with some pictures. So you can grab images very easily now. And so either match to a picture or within a picture. So what are they doing? Kind of labeling actions or whatever vocabulary is going on there, but to work with some visual images.
And Christine, would that be mainly at lower levels or not necessarily?
Probably at lower levels. But you know, depending, I guess, on what the word is, kind of, I guess you could do it at some upper levels.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. I think that's a really important point. And I just want to sort of elaborate a little on this idea that one thing we don't want to do is, you know, and I mean, this is what Christine's suggesting is some kind of in some way, a kind of matching exercise, kind of, where you, maybe not traditional matching, but you have a certain number of pictures and you have to match those to words somehow or other, right? Or you have to maybe produce that language. What we don't want to do is, what we're testing are the vocabulary words, right? We absolutely, I think that's without a doubt, we're trying to test those vocabulary words. What we don't want to do is make the item harder than the word, because then we're not testing the word, we're testing the definition. So if they're very basic words, but the students can't read the definitions, it's not a fair test. So absolutely, I mean, this is a great point, and I'm sorry I left it off this presentation actually, is that at low levels, using pictures is key, because then we're not confusing students with definitions or context that they can't really read and understand, because then we're no longer testing the vocabulary, we're testing something else, right? So yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Other,
Yeah, hello.
May
Can I come in? Hilaire?
Hilaire, please.
All right, thank you for a bit of contribution about the question, what type of vocabulary do we test here in Togo, in West Africa? In my country, we're having a new syllabus for students, which is the competency-based learning, CBLT. In that, on the vocabulary aspect, we do tests bringing in what we call the old man, ruling students to be ruling the old man out of a list of words that are provided to them. We do carefully make it so that the words that are provided are connected. The words are connected to the theme being studied in class, and which goes actually to your line of we teachers being careful when we are designing our tests. So that is a bit of my contribution.
Yeah, so I'm just writing this down. Absolutely. So pictures, I noted, and then yeah, connecting vocabulary to themes. Absolutely. So it might be, at the bank or in a restaurant or in the classroom. That's what you mean by themes, right?
Actually.
Yeah. Wonderful. Great. Thank you. Other comments and questions?
If I may, Michael.
Please.
Yeah, for example, for very, very basic levels, especially children, drawing also is sometimes used. So they get a word and they have to make a drawing of it. And of course, you're going to say the drawing may not be completely clear or neat, but it depends on what you ask students to draw, whether it is an animal, for example. It could be an animal, and then you can ask them to color the animal, I don't know, brown or another color. That's something else that can be done with very little ones. And I think that we have used that, and I think it's it has given good results, and it's fun at the same time. And then maybe another activity that can be used, but then this would be for more advanced levels or intermediate up, that would be providing definitions, okay? So providing definitions, and then students have to come up with the word being defined.
Okay, so this is productive.
Yes. I mean, I would say that if they are given the definitions, sorry, not the teacher is providing the definitions, or student to student, if it is an activity that can be done in pairs, I don't know, maybe formative assessment, then one has a definition and the other one has to identify what is being defined.
Okay, so it's sort of I'll just add that. So in pairs, could be, possibly. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Victoria.
Thank you. First of all, I wish to thank you sharing your great experience and ideas. And I also wish to add that, for example, we used to use such techniques as reading comprehension, access, understanding vocabulary through, for example, reading passages and related questions, and my students like do it. And the most simple for me and for my colleagues, also multiple choice questions. We provide several options for the definition or using of a word. And well, matching also, which you today showed us, close tests are well done for my students. They also prefer doing that, and I like the results. It helps us in teaching. And what else? And some of you, which you showed, maybe writing prompts. It seems to me it's also very helpful technique. As for me, it's requires students, for example, to write sentences or paragraphs using specific vocabulary words. It depends on the level which we're teaching at the moment. So.
Yeah, and that's a little bit like the one where you had write about a holiday with 5 of these words, right? And Liliana, I see your hand. Just one moment. I want to go back just to follow up on something that Victoria was saying. I just want to go back for a second. She talked about close. I just want to go back to say, you know, an alternative here. One alternative is to create a kind of drop down. If you're doing this on a computer, a kind of drop down, or if you're doing it on paper, you could create it on paper. So that they're not necessarily, it's still a close. They still have this, you know, large context model rather than a small context model where you have like one sentence. Here's a large context model, but they do have some choices. It's just an option for close. And I think it makes close a little, well, easier, I guess, but maybe more valid as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And someone had their hand up. I'm sorry. That was Ljubljana, wasn't it?
Liliana, yes. Sorry, I'm not turning my camera on because I'm in bed with a virus or something like that.
Okay.
But I just wanted to share my experience with closed tests. You said you don't like them. I really do.
Oh, that's fine. That's really fine. Yes, that's wonderful to hear.
Yes. So I have a couple of versions of closed tests, and you know, a very good experience with them. So one would be 2 variations on a regular closed test with the vocabulary items that the students need to use in the blanks given above the text. So that's for like, I mean, that's what I use for intermediate and upper intermediate levels. And then another version of this would be to give double the number of the vocabulary items compared to the number of the blanks. So like maybe 10, there are 10 blanks in the text, and there are 20 vocabulary items given above. So so for each of the right or correct items to be put in a particular blank, there's one distractor. Like, for example, if my target in a particular blank is, I don't know, everyday, like everyday English, so as an adjective, which should be spelled with as a single word, then as a distractor, I also provide everyday, 2 words, as an adverb of time, so that, you know, the students have an opportunity to clarify some commonly confused, you know, so to clarify some common problems, or we call them confusables, confusing vocabulary items. So that has proven to be very, very good. And also, of course, there's always the open close. So, but of course, as you said, it's very, very time consuming for the teacher. So I don't think that there's any text that you can find anywhere that is perfect for your purposes, but you have to modify it
Yes.
so that somehow guide the students or tie their hands when it comes to the choice of the word or phrase they would provide in each blank. And of course, you have to be flexible because it's usually impossible to predict what other options that are also acceptable students may come up with. Yeah, also, I think that for higher levels of proficiency, especially for future language teachers, for future ESL or EFL teachers, spot the errors exercises may also be very useful because one part of their future job would be correcting their students' work, their homework, their papers, and so on. So they themselves first need to be able to recognize some word or phrase as a mistake, and then they have to be able to provide a direct correction, or like to change to correct whatever is incorrect by making a minimal change. So not to paraphrase, for example, the whole sentence, but just to make a minimal correction and turn the whole sentence into a correct one.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Liliana. Where are you zooming in from today?
I'm calling from Serbia.
From Serbia. I actually, well, looking at your name, I was guessing it was Serbia, but I wasn't quite sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
it's impossible to pronounce.
Liliana Mihailovic, yeah?
It's Ljiljana Mihailovic.
Okay. And then Mihailovic, it's actually my name. So when you think about it, right?
Yes, exactly. It is. It is. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I hope you're feeling better.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. I'll be feeling better tomorrow.
Great.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you. And any other comments? We're almost out of time. Any other comments? I'm so happy to hear from people. All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending today. In that case. Again, we want to thank our sponsor, International Test of English Language Proficiency, or ITEP. And yeah, thanks so much to them. And please join me next month. I'm so happy to see all of you. You're welcome to come next month. So thanks for listening. Thanks for participating. Next month, we'll be talking about, and that will be, I think, mid-May, a workshop on designing speaking prompts or speaking tests. So that's what we'll be doing next month. Thanks, everyone. And I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you.